In a world where headlines often highlight division and conflict, an extraordinary story emerges from the streets of Hidden Hills, California. A young boy's desperate quest for help leads him to the doorstep of one of music's most controversial figures. What unfolds next isn't just a story of bullying and fame. It's a testament to the power of human connection that transcends all barriers. Join us on this incredible journey that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about courage, redemption, and the unexpected bridges that connect us all. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share in the comments where you're watching from. Every story becomes more meaningful when shared with our growing family of viewers. The autumn wind whispered through the streets of Hidden Hills, carrying with it the weight of 15-year-old Marcus Thompson's desperation. His trembling hand hovered over the ornate doorbell of the mansion that loomed before him, its pristine white facade a stark contrast to the darkness he felt inside. The bruises on his ribs were still fresh from that morning's encounter with the football team, but it wasn't the physical pain that brought him here. It was the crushing weight of 3 years of relentless torment at Washington High School. Marcus knew this was crazy. Standing at Kanye West's front door wasn't exactly a normal Tuesday afternoon activity for a sophomore from the wrong side of town, but he'd seen the rapper's recent interviews about his own struggles with bullying, and after watching his mother cry herself to sleep last night over his latest school incident report, something inside him snapped. He needed help, and conventional channels had failed him time and time again. His finger finally made contact with the doorbell, its melodic chime echoing through what he imagined were vast, empty hallways. Seconds stretched into eternities as he stood there, his worn backpack clutched to his chest like a shield. The security cameras above tracked his every movement, and he could feel his courage beginning to crumble. Just as he turned to leave, convinced this was the stupidest decision he'd ever made, the heavy door creaked open. A tall security guard regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Can I help you?" Marcus swallowed hard, his rehearsed speech suddenly evaporating. I need to speak with Mr. West, please. It's important." His voice cracked on the last word, and he could feel tears threatening to spill over. "I've tried everything else. I need help." The guard's expression softened slightly, but he maintained his professional demeanor. "Son, Mr. West isn't accepting visitors today. You'll need to let him in." The voice came from behind the guard, deep and unmistakable. Marcus's heart stopped as Kanye West himself appeared in the doorway, dressed casually in a black hoodie and jeans. His eyes, usually intense in media appearances, studied Marcus with an unexpected gentleness. "Sir, I don't recommend," the guard began, but Kanye raised his hand. "I was that kid once," Kanye said quietly, then addressed Marcus directly. "You look like you could use a conversation." As Marcus stepped into the mansion's foyer, his legs barely supporting him, he couldn't have known that this moment would change not only his life, but would spark a movement that would reach far beyond the gilded gates of Hidden Hills. The security guard closed the door behind them, and Marcus found himself standing in a space that felt simultaneously vast and intimate, with modern art adorning the walls and a grand piano catching the late afternoon light. Kanye gestured toward a comfortable sitting area, where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the California hills. "Sit," he said, not unkindly. "Tell me what brought you to my door." Marcus sank into the plush chair, his hands shaking as he unzipped his backpack. He pulled out a worn journal, its pages filled with lyrics, drawings, and the raw emotions of a teenager trying to make sense of his world. "I've been writing ever since they started." He couldn't finish the sentence, but Kanye's eyes fell to the fresh bruises visible beneath Marcus's sleeve. "Sometimes," Kanye said, settling into the chair opposite him, "the hardest beats make the most powerful songs." He reached for the journal, and as Marcus handed it over, a single sheet slipped out, a carefully crafted letter that would reveal just how deep the young man's struggles went, and set in motion a chain of events that neither of them could have anticipated. The California sun began its descent behind the hills, casting long shadows across the room as Marcus began to share his story. Neither of them realized that this conversation would soon capture the nation's attention and force America to confront some uncomfortable truths about bullying, fame, and the unexpected ways healing can begin with a single knock on a door. The journal's pages trembled in Kanye's hands as his eyes moved across Marcus's carefully penned words. The room had grown quiet, save for the soft hum of the home's climate system and the occasional distant sound of security radio chatter. Marcus watched as the rapper's expression shifted from curiosity to something deeper, more personal. "Your flow," Kanye finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's pain here, but there's power too." He turned to a particular page where Marcus had written about the daily ritual of taking alternate routes to class, of eating lunch alone in empty classrooms, of watching his mother's face crumble each time the school called. "You've been carrying this weight for a long time." Marcus nodded, his throat tight. 3 years. "It started when I transferred to Washington High. I thought if I just kept my head down, wrote my music, it would get better. But it just keeps getting worse." He pulled up his sleeve, revealing a tapestry of bruises in various stages of healing. "The teachers see it. They just don't want to deal with it. The football team, they're untouchable." Kanye set the journal down carefully, his usual media persona completely absent. In its place was something raw, authentic, a reflection of his own past that Marcus had only glimpsed in rare interviews. "You know what they don't tell you about bullying?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "It's not just about the physical pain, it's about the silence, the shame, the way it makes you question your worth." As if on cue, Marcus's phone buzzed, another threatening message from his tormentors. Kanye caught the fear that flashed across the boy's face. "Let me see it." With shaking hands, Marcus handed over his phone. The message was brutal. "Saw you heading to Hidden Hills. Getting desperate? Wait till tomorrow. Nobody's gonna save you." Kanye's jaw tightened. He stood abruptly, pacing the length of the windows as the last rays of sunlight painted the hills in shades of amber and gold. "Tomorrow," he said finally, turning back to Marcus. "You're not going to school alone." What do you mean?" "I mean, it's time to change the narrative." Kanye pulled out his own phone, sending rapid-fire texts. "You came here looking for help, but what you're about to get is something bigger. A revolution." Within minutes, the mansion's quiet was broken by the arrival of Kanye's team, publicists, security personnel, and his personal videographer. As they filed into the room, Marcus shrank back in his chair, overwhelmed by the sudden flurry of activity. "Listen up," Kanye commanded, and the room fell silent. "Tomorrow we're going to Washington High, but first, we're going to do something they never expected." He turned to Marcus. "We're going to turn your pain into power. Right here, right now." For the next several hours, as night settled over Hidden Hills, Marcus found himself in Kanye's personal recording studio. His journal entries were transformed into lyrics, his scattered thoughts shaped into verses that spoke of resilience and resistance. With each take, each refinement, Marcus felt something shifting inside him, fear giving way to determination. But neither of them could have predicted how their impromptu recording session would explode across social media the next morning, or how their planned visit to Washington High would spiral into national headlines. As Marcus finally left the mansion well past midnight, clutching a USB drive containing their collaboration, he had no idea that his bullies were already plotting their most brutal retaliation yet. The security team escorted him to the waiting car that would take him home, but Kanye's parting words echoed in his mind. "Tomorrow, we show them that sometimes the biggest change starts with the smallest knock on a door." What Marcus didn't know was that somewhere in Washington High, a student had already leaked their plans for tomorrow, and a storm was brewing that would test not only his newfound courage, but Kanye's commitment to his cause in ways neither of them could have imagined. Dawn broke over Washington High School with an unusual electricity in the air. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray morning sky like metal fingers. The collaboration between Kanye West and an unknown bullied student had gone viral overnight, their raw, unfinished track already trending across social media platforms. Marcus stood in front of his bathroom mirror, his mother's worried voice drifting up from downstairs. The bruises from yesterday seemed to mock him, but something else caught his eye, a glimmer of strength he'd never noticed before. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications, his social media following having exploded from a few dozen to over 50,000 in mere hours. "Baby, you don't have to do this," his mother said when he finally came downstairs. She stood in their modest kitchen, still wearing her night shift nurse's scrubs. "We can find another school." Marcus touched the USB drive in his pocket, their midnight recording session preserved in digital form. "Mom, running away won't fix this. Not just for me, but for everyone else too." The screech of tires outside announced Kanye's arrival, but instead of the expected luxury SUV, a convoy of vehicles pulled up, 3 black Escalades flanked by motorcycle escorts. News cameras swiveled toward their house as Kanye emerged. dressed not in his usual designer gear, but in a simple black hoodie matching the one he'd given Marcus the night before. "You ready to change some lives?" Kanye asked as Marcus approached, camera flashes creating a strobe effect around them. The rapper's expression was intense, focused. He'd been up all night too, his team working to ensure their message wouldn't be twisted by the media circus that was already forming. But as they approached Washington High, the scene that greeted them was beyond anything they'd anticipated. The entire student body seemed to be gathered outside, divided into clear factions. The football team and their supporters formed a wall of Letterman jackets near the main entrance. Opposite them, a larger group of students wore black hoodies, a silent statement of solidarity that had spread through social media overnight. Principal Davidson waited at the top of the steps, his face ashen. "Mr. West, this is highly irregular. We have protocols." "Protocols that let this happen?" Kanye's voice carried across the suddenly silent crowd as he gestured to Marcus's bruises. "How many other kids are suffering while you hide behind protocols?" The lead bully, Todd Mitchell, quarterback and son of the school board president, stepped forward. "This is all just attention-seeking. He probably did that to himself, and now he's got some celebrity wrapped up in his lies." But Todd's words were cut short as an unexpected voice rang out. "I saw you do it." Sarah Chen, head of the school newspaper, emerged from the crowd, clutching her phone. "I have videos. Every incident. Every time the teachers looked away. Every threat." Her hands shook, but her voice remained steady. "I was too scared to say anything before. We all were, but not anymore." The crowd shifted, murmurs growing as more students stepped forward, phones raised, each carrying evidence of years of overlooked abuse. What had started as one boy's desperate plea for help was transforming into something much larger, a moment of collective courage that would soon ripple far beyond the confines of Washington High. Principal Davidson's face drained of color as he watched his carefully maintained facade of order crumble. But none of them could have predicted what Todd would do next, an act of desperate violence that would turn their planned peaceful confrontation into national headlines and force everyone involved to decide exactly how far they were willing to go for what they believed in. The tension in the air crystallized as Todd lunged, not at Marcus, but at Sarah Chen's phone. The device clattered across the concrete steps, its screen spiderwebbing with cracks but still recording. The crowd's collective gasp was cut short by Kanye's security team moving swiftly to contain the situation, their practiced movements speaking of countless similar interventions. But it was Marcus who surprised everyone. Instead of retreating, he stepped forward, his voice carrying across the now silent courtyard with unexpected authority. "Play it, Sarah. Play it all." Sarah's trembling fingers found her backup cloud storage. And suddenly the school's exterior speakers, normally reserved for morning announcements, crackled to life with a symphony of stored evidence. Todd's threats, the sound of fists meeting flesh, the laughter of bystanders, and most damning of all, the voices of teachers making excuses to look the other way. "Your father can't buy your way out of this one," Marcus said, meeting Todd's wild-eyed stare. The quarterback's usual swagger had evaporated, replaced by something closer to panic as he watched his carefully constructed world begin to unravel. Kanye stood slightly apart, his expression unreadable as he watched his young protege navigate this crucial moment. This wasn't the orchestrated media event his team had planned. It was something raw, authentic, and potentially far more powerful. Local news cameras whirred, their operators jockeying for better angles as Principal Davidson attempted damage control. These recordings were obtained without consent, like the consent you got before letting kids get beaten in your hallways. The sharp question came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Reynolds, the veteran English teacher who had watched the situation deteriorate for years. She emerged from the crowd, clutching a worn leather portfolio. "I've documented every incident reported to administration, every dismissed complaint, every time we were told to let boys be boys or avoid rocking the boat." The morning sun had fully risen now, its light revealing the tears streaming down Sarah Chen's face as she continued to project evidence of years of systematic abuse. But these weren't tears of fear anymore. They were tears of relief, of finally being heard. Todd's father arrived minutes later, his luxury sedan screeching to a halt in the fire lane. Thomas Mitchell III, president of the school board and partner at the city's most prestigious law firm, emerged in an immaculate suit that seemed almost garish in the raw emotion of the moment. "This ends now," he announced, his practiced courtroom voice cutting through the chaos. "Any evidence obtained without consent is inadmissible. This isn't your courtroom. Tom. Kanye's voice was quiet but carried the weight of someone used to being heard. He stepped forward, positioning himself between the Mitchells and Marcus. This is reality. Raw, unfiltered, ugly reality. And sometimes reality needs to be faced without legal filters and PR spin. The rapper pulled out his phone, and suddenly the school's speakers carried a different sound. Marcus's voice from their late-night recording session, laid over a haunting beat that seemed to capture all the pain and promise of this moment. Behind these walls of silence where power builds its throne, every bruise becomes a statement, every scar a stepping stone. The impact was immediate and visceral. Students began to pull out their phones, live streaming the moment as Marcus's truth poured out across the morning air. But no one could have anticipated how the next few minutes would unfold, as Todd Mitchell made a decision that would transform this school confrontation into a watershed moment in America's conversation about bullying, privilege, and the power of truth in the age of social media. The morning sun cast long shadows across Washington High's courtyard as Todd Mitchell did something no one expected. He began to cry. Not the manufactured tears of someone caught in wrongdoing, but the raw, ugly sobs of someone whose carefully constructed world was crumbling. The Letterman jacket that had been his armor suddenly seemed to hang heavy on his shoulders, like a weight he could no longer bear. "I never," he choked out, his father's hand frozen halfway to his shoulder. "I never wanted to be this person." The words seemed to surprise even him, drawn out by the haunting echo of Marcus's lyrics still floating through the morning air. Kanye West stood quietly, his usual media-ready persona replaced by something more contemplative. He'd seen this moment before, when image and reality collide, when the masks people wear begin to crack. His hand found Marcus's shoulder, a subtle gesture of support as the scene unfolded. Sarah Chen's livestream counter ticked past 100,000 viewers, her steady hands capturing what would later be described as a pivotal moment in modern youth culture. But it was Mrs. Reynolds who understood the weight of what was happening. After 30 years of teaching, she recognized the rare moment when truth breaks through the carefully constructed facades of adolescence. "My father." Todd's voice cracked as he turned to face his dad, whose polished exterior had begun to show hairline fractures of its own. "Every time I came home with less than perfect grades, less than perfect game stats, you'd tell me the same thing. Mitchells don't show weakness, Mitchells dominate." His next words came out as barely a whisper. "I became the thing I was most afraid of." The national media crews that had gathered pushed closer, sensing the story evolving beyond their predicted narrative of celebrity intervention. This wasn't just about bullying anymore. It was about the cycles of pressure, privilege, and pain that shaped young lives. Principal Davidson stood frozen on the steps, decades of administrative training offering no protocol for this kind of raw authenticity. But it was Marcus who moved first, stepping away from Kanye's protective presence toward his former tormentor. "I hear you," he said simply, those 3 words cutting through the morning air with unexpected power. Maybe that's what this was always about, being heard. Thomas Mitchell III's carefully crafted legal arguments died in his throat as he watched his son's carefully constructed facade crumble completely. The man who had spent decades crafting perfect narratives in courtrooms found himself speechless in the face of unvarnished truth. Kanye's voice, when it came, carried the weight of someone who understood both sides of this moment all too well. "This is what healing looks like," he said, not to the cameras, but to the students who stood witnessing this transformation. "It's messy, it's uncomfortable, but it's real." The school's speakers had fallen silent, but something else filled the air. The sound of hundreds of students finding their voices, sharing their own stories in a cascade of long-suppressed truth. The black hoodies that had been meant as a symbol of protest became something else, a uniform of unity, of shared experience and understanding. But as the morning wore on and the initial shock began to fade, new questions emerged. How would this moment of raw honesty translate into lasting change? Could a system built on decades of silence and power dynamics truly transform? And perhaps most importantly, what would happen when the cameras left and the real work of healing began? The answer would come from an unexpected source and would challenge not just Washington High, but schools across the nation to confront the complex dynamics that turn children into both victims and perpetrators. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, none of them realized that the most profound part of their journey was just beginning. 6 months later, the lights of a CNN studio cast long shadows across Marcus Thompson's face as he sat beside Kanye West, waiting for their segment to begin. The makeup artist had tried to conceal his nervousness, but there was something authentic about the slight tremor in his hands as he adjusted his collar, the same black hoodie that had become a symbol of change across American schools. "Remember," Kanye said quietly, as the production assistant counted down from 10, "your truth is enough." It always was. The months following that transformative morning at Washington High had reshaped not just Marcus's life, but the national conversation about bullying and privilege. Their impromptu recording had evolved into a full album, each track featuring a different voice from schools across the country. But more importantly, it had sparked a movement that transcended music. "Welcome back to CNN Tonight," the anchor began, her practiced tone carrying just a hint of genuine curiosity. 6 months ago, a viral video captured a moment that would change how we think about bullying in American schools. Tonight we're joined by the two people at the center of that story. The monitor showed footage from that morning. Todd Mitchell's breakdown, the cascade of revelations, the moment when silence finally broke. But what the cameras hadn't captured was what happened after, in the quiet weeks that followed. "Todd and I meet every week now," Marcus revealed, his voice steady despite the national audience. "Not because we have to, but because we choose to. We're building something new out of the ruins of what was broken." The anchor leaned forward, genuinely intrigued. "And Mr. West, what made you take such a personal interest in this situation? Surely you receive many requests for help." Kanye's response was measured, thoughtful, a far cry from his often controversial media appearances. Sometimes the smallest knock on a door can be the loudest call for change. "What Marcus taught me, taught all of us, is that real strength isn't about domination. It's about transformation." The segment cut to live footage from Washington High, where the changes were visible even through the camera lens. The rigid social hierarchies had given way to something more fluid, more humane. Principal Davidson had resigned, replaced by Mrs. Reynolds, whose first act had been to establish the nation's most comprehensive peer support program. "But the real story," Marcus continued, "isn't about me or Todd or even Kanye. It's about what happens when we stop accepting the roles we're given and start writing our own story." The camera panned to show a wall of screens behind them, each displaying similar scenes from schools across the country. Students wearing black hoodies, sharing stories, breaking down the barriers of silence that had protected abusers for generations. The movement had taken on a life of its own, far beyond what any of them could have predicted. Thomas Mitchell III had undergone his own transformation, channeling his legal expertise into drafting comprehensive anti-bullying legislation that was now making its way through Congress. Todd had found his voice as a speaker, sharing his journey from perpetrator to advocate with a raw honesty that resonated with both bullies and victims. As the segment drew to a close, the anchor asked one final question. "What would you say to that scared 15-year-old boy who stood on Kanye West's doorstep 6 months ago?" Marcus smiled, his eyes meeting Kanye's briefly before turning back to the camera. "I would tell him that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help, and that even the darkest moments can become stepping stones to something beautiful." The studio lights dimmed as they went to commercial, but the real impact of their story continued to ripple outward. In schools across America, doors were being knocked on, voices were being raised, and the cycles of silence were being broken one conversation at a time. Later that evening, as Marcus and Kanye left the studio, they found a group of students waiting outside, each wearing the now iconic black hoodie. One stepped forward, her hands trembling just as Marcus's had on that fateful morning. "I need help," she said simply. Marcus looked at Kanye, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Together they stepped forward to listen, understanding that their story hadn't really ended. It had just become part of something much larger. A continuing symphony of voices rising against the silence, each knock on a door echoing with the promise of change.